Now, I want you guys to follow this point because this is very, very important. This is a passage we're going to look at here that really is overlooked in the question of the New Testament canon. So, what I'm going to argue here is that the Old Testament canon anticipates and presupposes a New Testament canon. Remember, earlier we spoke of those two great redemptive events that marked the initiation of canonical literature. The first, God redeeming his people from Egypt. What is the second? God redeeming his people from sin through the propitiatory sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ, who is one greater than Moses. The Messiah is going to come, we find, and initiate a new covenant with his own blood, not with the blood of bulls and goats. And so after 400 years of silence, God is going to reveal himself to his people, and this revelation will be the greatest revelation that God ever makes. Consider how John puts it in his gospel. And I want you to listen carefully because I'm going to sort of translate it a little differently than maybe you've thought of. All right? So, in the beginning was the Word. Okay, I'm going to suggest translating a little differently. In the beginning was the revelation. And the revelation was with God. And the revelation was God. And the revelation, verse 14, became flesh and dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. In other words, the incarnation marks the supreme revelation from God. Note how John further underscores this fact in verse 17. Focus on this passage. He says, "For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." That's the key passage. I want to suggest what we have here in verse 17 are two mediators, namely Moses and Christ. Secondly, we have two covenants. The law, grace and truth. And moreover, I would say that we have two canons. The law represents the Old Testament canon, which is completed. Grace and truth refer to a New Testament canon not yet completed, but anticipated and presupposed. Let me try to develop this point a little further. Why do you think that John is contrasting the Old Testament as law and the New Testament as grace and truth? Is John suggesting that grace and truth are not principles that operated in Old Testament religion? Well, I don't think that's the point he's making. I know if you have the Schofield Reference Bible, that's the impression you get, that in the Old Testament people were saved by law, in the New Testament were saved by grace. But that's not what John here is saying. We know that because the God who gave the law to Moses revealed himself in Exodus chapter 34, verse 5 and 6 as, and I quote, Yahweh, Yahweh, full of grace and truth. Okay? And then after Moses sees that glorious display of grace and truth, he descends from the mountain and his face is radiating that glory to the people of Israel. Not directly, but indirectly, reflected through Moses' face. And so the Old Testament, just like the New Testament, did reveal grace and truth. Somebody says, well, then why is John drawing this contrast? Well, the answer is he's highlighting, I think, the superiority of the new covenant and its mediator. You see, the old covenant did contain grace and truth, but that grace and truth was only, we might say, promissory in form. It was, as it were, a shadow. You remember, God's people could not look directly into Moses' face. They could only see it reflected indirectly. In fact, Moses even had to put a veil over his face. Why? Because the people in the Old Covenant were not ready for the full revelation of God's grace and truth. But in the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son, the Word, the revelation par excellence. Okay? And now the veil is going to be taken away from the law of Moses. Now God's people are ready to see God's glory in all of its fullness. Instead of sending Moses down the mountain to reflect His grace and truth, God the Son comes down the mountain Himself, full of grace and truth. And we read in verse 18, John 1, verse 18, no one has ever seen God, the only God, or depending on what variant in the Greek you follow, the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father. He has made Him known. And the Greek term behind that English translation is the word from which we get the term exegesis. The Son has exegeted the Father, or more literally, He's brought the Father to light in a way that far transcends the revelation of Moses. And so, here's my point. Jesus Christ Himself is the new covenant word from God. And this is also the point of Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, which we've already read, where the writer says, long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. That's the Old Testament canon. But then in verse 2, he identifies a New Testament canon. But in these last days, God has spoken to us by His Son. The first time God spoke, He spoke by way of promise. But in the second time He speaks, we have a canon of fulfillment. And so we can conclude that the Old Testament canon anticipates and presupposes a New Testament canon.